Everybody. Thanks for registering and attending our new webinar, Defeating Cloud Zombies. We're Sonory Security, and we've got some great content for you today. We're joined by the amazing Jeff Moncrief.
Hey, everyone. Good to be here.
We'll give everybody a couple, let's say 45 seconds to keep filing in here. I see some people already sharing where they're from. How about everybody mention how much snow you got last week? So I'm here in the DFW Metroplex, and it was cold, but no snow. So let us know how much snow you got last week.
Matt, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I've got you.
All right. You let me know when you're ready to kick off.
Yep, couple more seconds. Got some people still coming in. Okay, I'd say we're good to go. Jeff, it's all yours.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. I'm super excited to be talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and that is zombies. All right. So today we're going to have a great session. We're going to tell you a little bit about what zombies are, why they matter, why they're important, but also why they're incredibly frustrating to deal with, certainly at scale. We're going to do a little overview of really what you can try and do to manually implement a strategy to tackle zombies, or some tooling that's out there to actually kind of help you automate any part of the process of dealing with zombies. But I'm Sunry's field CTO. I also run the sales engineering team here. I've been here almost 5 years, so I have seen a lot of problems and challenges with folks that are dealing with least privilege problems in the public cloud. Most certainly dealing with IAM issues inside AWS, which is really what we're going to be talking about today. So let's jump into it. So what's a zombie? All right. So zombies are a term that we call here, that we call unused identities here at Sunry. Okay. So we have been in the business of really illuminating problems with least privilege in the public cloud for 6 years now. And the one thing that we keep finding over and over with our clients is that there is a huge problem with identity sprawl. And it doesn't matter if it's, human identities or what, the industry calls non-human identities now inside, the identity fabric, or if it's single sign-on federated users. The bottom line is that there's still a lot of things that are out there that are left behind from projects past, from teams past, from initiatives past, that are just forgotten about. They're lost, they're forgotten about. Certainly when we have account sprawl, and you have to try and figure out, cleanup, so to speak, for things you might have been testing and things like that. But the bottom line is those identities have entitlements, they have permissions, they're turned on, they're active, they are risks to the business. And if you think about, a lot of the tooling that's out there today, whether that's native tooling like IAM Access Analyzer or third-party CSPM, CNAP type tooling, they are going to show you this problem, right? But there's this inherent fear and paralyzation that comes over folks that we'll talk about when it comes to actually dealing with it, right? So I think it's super, super important to call out. Fact to call out, though, is that when you're looking at identity risk, you're going to see things, it doesn't matter what your tool of choice is, you're going to see things like really scary identity chains that are essentially the kill chain that can play out through the identity fabric, where you can jump from one role into another role, you can exploit across account trust and go from one account into another, you can privilege escalate, and you're going to see those scary, scary chains. What we found over the years, without a doubt, is the vast majority of the hops on those chains are unused. Okay. There's so many unused roles, unused instance profiles, unused service accounts, service principals. And that's just an example of non-human identities, right? Don't forget about so those IAM users that are still sometimes left out there or, created temporarily and forgotten about. The bottom line is the vast majority of those identities are unused. All right. And then the majority of those are non-human, as I was saying, right? But they're out there, they have those entitlements, they have those permissions, and you cannot ignore them. Because many times they've got, especially if they're roles, they've got access keys or things like that that are associated with them, or identities that might be a part of the next GitHub repo exposure. You've got to account for that risk, because if one of those identities gets popped, then they have access straight into the dead center of your cloud. What about third parties? Right? I'm not just talking about things that you've built and that belong to you. What about all the third parties that you've tested over the years? Right? Maybe it was a product that you trialed or whatever it might be. That identity, we're seeing it almost 100% of the time. They're still sitting out there in these prospects and these clients' clouds, and they haven't been used in not just months, but I'm talking years. Okay. We cannot ignore these unused identities. Now, why do they matter? Proliferation. That is a huge part of the issue, right? Not just the risk of them being out there, but they just keep getting more and more numerous. I would use the term identity crisis when it comes to what we see with the growing landscape with anyone that we're working with from a starting point, and then watching the trend over time with non-human identity growth, but then those non-human identities becoming stale. All right. And there's infrastructure as code that's pushing it out. Like I said, there's third parties, there's individual initiatives, there's account sprawl. It all leads to really just the exacerbation of this problem right here, right? So you have the problem. What do? Right? So are you going to research every single one of these and figure out whether or not you can safely delete them? Are you going to research every single one of these and figure out the individual entitlements that it does and does not need, and try and actually get every single one of them to least privilege? We've seen that. Okay. I've seen the movie, and we at Summary have seen that for years here, playing in the cloud infrastructure entitlement management space with recommending these kinds of things to organizations. And when you're dealing with thousands, sometimes, we've seen over 50,000 zombies across any number of accounts. It can be 50, it can be 850. It doesn't really matter. It becomes impossible. You're never going to get these to least privilege. And when it comes to deleting them, it's almost impossible to come up with a process to do it safely in a way that you can guarantee that you're not going to break the business and put your own job at risk for deleting something that you really shouldn't have deleted. And then even if you were to try and get it to least privilege, you're going to be dealing with the problem that you still have the possibility of breaking something that the business requires. You've gotten it to least privilege, but there's really no process or flow to adjust those privileges and notify the business that that you need to grant some entitlements back to something that you may have gotten to least privilege from a zombie standpoint. Okay. Now we're getting into, if you want to try and tackle this and delete it yourself, you can. All right. So, we've worked with an organization in the past and it took them 10 months to safely research and delete 2,000 identities. All right. The problem was at the 10-month period, the problem had just regrown, right? It had just remanifested. And it's just a never-ending cycle by the time that you can get to that point. But in order to get there, you have to essentially deploy FTEs to research these, figure out who owns it, why did they create it, when did they create it, is it needed? And at that point in time, you can then make an educated decision to delete it, right? But it just becomes an impossible task, especially when you're focusing on the spokes, we'll call it. So if you think about a hub and a spoke model, we'll talk about this all the time. Dealing with zombies and unused identities today with the current tooling, it's very spoke based. It's focused on every single individual identity, and every single one needs to have a policy applied to it or be manually deleted. And you'll see that this spoke mindset, it's just impossible. And that's why we have to kind of flip our mindset from the hub and spoke standpoint. And I'll show you what we mean by that here in a minute. But it is very easy, I'd say, to discover unused identities inside the identity fabric in AWS. There's native tools. These are screenshots from Access Analyzer from IAM. You can use third-party tools like a CNAP or a CSPM if you want more of a unified dashboard versus doing it account by account by account, kind of what you see here in this screenshot. But it's not that hard to discover, right, whether or not you have all these unused identities in your cloud estate. The real challenge is when it comes to remediating the risk. Okay. Now, if we wanted to come up with an alternate strategy other than deleting, we could, right? We call it quarantining. here at Sunry. But you could come up with a manual strategy that actually quarantines all of these, right? And that's essentially putting a deny all on every single one of these unused identities. That will effectively remove all the risk associated with them. But then you're also implementing a big issue into the or introducing a big issue into the business, because you're removing all these entitlements that are probably going to be needed at some point in time, and there's no flow associated with granting these entitlements back. Okay, so yes, you've removed the risk. Yes, you've done it. It's a very tedious manual process, like I've stated. But at the same time, you haven't really helped the business, because you've essentially removed all these entitlements from all these unused things that are out there without understanding whether or not they're needed or not needed, and then having no process in place to quickly adjust and grant these entitlements back should the business need them on any of these identities. Okay. Now, if you wanted to implement this kind of quarantine strategy with the deny all, and the other thing is the deny all, if I go back one screen, this is shifting the mindset, by the way, from the hub and a spoke standpoint. With a deny all, we actually are flipping it to a hub mindset, a hub model, because when you secure the hub, which is the identity fabric itself, okay, all the spokes have to fall in line, which is amazing. It allows you to do some really, really interesting things. All right. But there's a couple of ways that we could go about doing this. Number one is do it completely by hand, right? You could write, a script or something like that, or leverage GitHub that will help you analyze used and unused, and then help you push out policies on every single one of these unused identities. It's possible, but very painful. All right. Then you've got cloud services and third-party tooling, right? And those cloud services are going to be things like IAM Access Analyzer and the vast majority of third-party tooling, which is going to make recommendations to you. So yes, you'll have that single pane of glass, that single dashboard showing you all these unused identities. But it's mostly a visibility story. You still have to go fix this yourself, right? And then there is an alternative, right? And it's called the Cloud Permissions Firewall. All right, now that is what Sunry sells. I'll be giving you a little glimpse of that here in a minute, but it is essentially a net new market that we are creating for getting to least privilege quickly. And it's flipping the model on its head by actually firewalling the identity fabric, and forcing all the spokes to fall in line, but doing it in a way to where you don't break the business when you need to grant these permissions back. So I'll give you a preview of that. All right, now a little bit deeper into doing it yourself, right? If you're going to do it yourself, I would recommend, leveraging something like, ChatGPT to kind of help you with the coding and whatnot. But you could write scripts that will go out and, you can run them, Python scripts in the Cloud Shell in AWS that will parse through all the identities. They will pull metadata on them about last use and whatnot. And then you could push out policies on every single one of these to deny permissions, whether, that's deny all, or just to specify get and list permissions and not, modify, permissions, delete things like that. But again, it's going to be very, very manual. And it's going to come back to that problem where it's inflexible should the needs of the business change tomorrow. But it is possible for you to research and figure out every single one of those zombies that are out there, and then make a decision about whether or not you also want to manually push policies on every single one of those. Does not scale. The next option would be the third-party tools. Okay. Now, the third-party tools, like I mentioned, they are, or the third-party tools and the cloud service tools, and they are really focused on visibility. Okay, visibility into over-permissioned roles and then identities, as well as the unused ones, i.e. the zombies. Okay. But when it comes to deleting them, they're just going to make a recommendation. They're not going to actually go delete them for you. And there's really no capability inside, things like Access Analyzer or your CSPM CNAP tool of choice to quarantine, right? With a single click, and certainly not at scale. And so you're going to see that when it comes to actually taking care of the problem and getting to least privilege, this is where a lot of the folks that we've worked with over the years, this is where they kind of get stuck. All right. It's because they're staring at the problem and they don't know what to actually do about the problem, and in a way that they feel safe. There's this fear and this paralyzation that comes over folks when it comes to, you've got to go delete all these different things. And they're so afraid that they're going to break something, that they're going to impede the business. They're going to delete something that maybe is only used once a year and they just don't know about it. And so what happens, and we've seen this over and over and over, is they just accept the risk. They just let it sit there. It's turned on. It's active. It has its entitlements. It's just risk to the business. So again, not what I would say the best solution, right? So in introducing a cloud permissions firewall, okay? This is a net new alternative, okay? This is not a CNAP. This is not a CSPM, all right? It has some of the same visibility that you would get in a CNAP or a CSPM or a CIEM tool, but it's all about taking action. So with a cloud permissions firewall, it introduces this ability to automate policy and orchestrate things on the fly that will allow you to understand where all these unused identities are across all your different accounts from a single pane of glass. Okay. It's not rocket science, right? There's some great least privilege analytics in there, but there's plenty of vendors and tools that do that. But the ability to quarantine them. And that's what's brand new, right? And that's what I was showing you the alternative of trying to do this by hand, right? Imagine if you could quarantine hundreds, if not thousands, of unused identities with a single click. And that's just automated, right? And then instantly all the risk associated with them goes away. And then if one needs to wake up, it can. And there's a flow built in that the business likes and understands, and that works with their current processes to grant those entitlements back through Microsoft Teams, through Slack, through email, all in real time, that allows one of these to wake up, go do what it needs to do for 10 minutes once a quarter, once a year, and then go back into the quarantine. So you can have as many identities out there as you want that exist, that have entitlements, but they can't use them until the cloud permissions firewall allows them. It's fascinating to see what this does to that risk landscape. Another important thing is, when you quarantine, doesn't matter how you do it, with a cloud permissions firewall or doing it by hand, you've essentially, you take a look at those identity chains that you're staring at in your CSPM or your CNAP that show all these scary lateral movement scenarios for the identity fabric. They collapse. The chains break. And our customers have asked us over the years, over and over, how do I break the chain? Where do I break the chain, right? And that's always a hard thing for us to tell them, because we're showing you that these 2 or 3 roles in this identity chain with role chaining, where they can assume one another, that haven't been used in 90 days. But how do I know that this isn't something that it isn't needed, for a month, or it's going to be needed 30 days from now or something like that, right? There's always that risk, right? So with a cloud permissions firewall, you have a better option. Okay. So with that being said, I'm actually going to show you a quick little scenario, right? So this is the Sunray Cloud Permissions Firewall, all right? This is not going to be a deep dive demo of the Cloud Permissions Firewall, okay? I'm just showing you what we do to attack zombies. Now, we do plug in very similar to like a CSPM or a CNAP tool with a role, and that allows us to give us that visibility very quickly. It only takes about 15 minutes, okay? For us to connect and to start our discovery. And then quickly, within a matter of hours, you kind of see the unused permissions landscape here. And this is going to be kind of mimicking that data that you see in your visibility tool of choice, whether that's a KIM, a CSPM, or a CNAP, right? You're going to see kind of left to right overprivileged identities, right? That you have to get to least privilege. Well, with the cloud permissions firewall, no more least privilege policies. We can get them to least privilege with one click. Then you see the zombies here. This is what we're going to focus on today. The 129. Then you see unused services, third parties, and regions. Okay, and these are some really great capabilities to automate service control policy writing, to remove service risk, to remove region risk, and we'll touch on third parties here in a second. But for zombies, okay, so you see there's 129 here. All right, and these are across all of the accounts in my organization. In the cloud permissions firewall, you can change the scope to see how many zombies that you may have in prod, in staging, in UAT, in your sandbox environment, right? Or you can just click the button here, which is going to show them all as well. I'm going to show you in the sandbox, you can see the different unused identities that we're dealing with here. Okay, little robot icon indicates a non-person identity. The human icon is a person. The robot icon could indicate a role. It could indicate a service account, an instance profile on an EC2 instance, which many people don't realize are the direct connection from any EC2 instance or workload straight into the heart of your cloud through the identity fabric. But we're going to pick on one here. We're going to pick on CPF zombie outbreak. Okay. You can see that we got kind of cute here in our demo system. We named them after different things from the Walking Dead show. You got Negan above it, but we're going to focus on the outbreak role here. So you can quarantine these in the Cloud Permissions Firewall one by one, or you can do them in mass. But in here, we're just going to do them one by just a one-off scenario. So we're going to quarantine that outbreak role. When we click quarantine, it's going to quickly modify something on that identity that says you can't use the entitlements that you've been granted. And it's because we have that default deny that we've automatically put in for you, so you didn't have to write that by hand. So a couple of the things that I was just showing you there, the alternative to doing this by hand, well, we're automating it all for you, right? So we have a default deny in there. We've now put that identity into the quarantine that says that you can't use your permissions because you're in isolation until the Cloud Permission Firewall says that you can, right? So we'll double check. We'll go to the quarantine and you'll see here that sure enough, this outbreak role is in the quarantine. So what we're going to do now is I'm actually going to show you those entitlements and we're going to try and wake this zombie up, right? And this is really cool because this gets into the whole flow of if you do it by hand, you've got to account for the fact that the business will be impacted, right? If you essentially put a deny all on any of these unused identities, right? So we're going to log into the sandbox. I'm going to go into IAM. We're going to go to roles, and you'll see here is the outbreak role. Okay, going to open it up, and you're going to see that it has two sets of permissions on it. It can EC2 full access as well as S3 full access, right? So bottom line is we haven't removed any permissions from it. You can see the entitlements that it has, but watch what happens when you try and do something with it when the Cloud Permissions Firewall has quarantined that identity. Okay, now remember, this could be an access key or something like that that's on the identity that someone got a hold of from a GitHub repo and they're trying to do this from the command line. Doesn't really matter. Okay, we're going to assume in as this role. So we're switching identities. Now watch what happens. Remember, it had S3 full access. Okay, I'm going to go into S3. I'm going to try to enumerate general purpose buckets. You don't have permissions to list the buckets. Okay, you see that there? You don't have permissions to list the buckets. It's because the entitlements are not allowed to be used. Now, in real time, what happened? Because the Cloud Permissions Firewall was monitoring for these exact events, if something tries to animate a zombie, okay, we have got it configured to where whoever is what we call the approver at this scope, remember this is a sandbox, this could be the development team, it could be the security team. I doubt it for a sandbox. You have all that flexibility in the Cloud Permissions Firewall, but you can essentially say if someone tries to animate one of these identities and it tries to wake up, send a message in real time within a millisecond to this individual over Slack or Teams or email. All right, and this is what it looks like. So we've got a Slack channel. We have a summary app in the Slack store and the Microsoft Teams store. But you'll see that the zombie outbreak in that sandbox, it attempted to do what? S3, list all my buckets. Now remember, this came to that individual within a second of that role getting denied. Okay? Now, if that role was never supposed to wake up, that's kind of cool because you actually got protected by that default deny, meaning that the identity wasn't able to wake up, and then you have this new message that's an indicator of compromise alert. So the firewall protected you, which is awesome. But if it does need to wake up, maybe it's something that needs to generate a report once a quarter or once a year. That's fine. All right. You can time box a temporary grant back to that identity right here in Slack. You can choose 1 hour, 2 hours, make it perpetual. You can put it, no, you don't really need to put a note in here, but you can if it's an individual that you're granting and permission back to go do something. You click approve. You can see that it's approved. This also happens in real time. In real time, there was a switch that was flipped on the cloud side using the orchestration that we have in place that basically says you can go use that entitlement for S3 for the next hour. So we're still logged in as the zombie. We're going to click S3. And notice this time it didn't take me to the S3 homepage. It took me straight to the general purpose buckets listing. Now I can see that there's 2 buckets there. There's My Health App Sandbox and Sally's Secret Stuff. I'm going to click My Health Sandbox, and there you go. You can now see the objects in there, right? And you can see these objects, they're fake, right? Credit card data, dental claim. There's some optical character recognition for a credit card image here. The point is that if this user is supposed to be allowed permission to go in here and do something, you granted it back, there's record of it, that's great. But if they weren't supposed to get access to this credit card data, you were protected from it. And now you have all that great information from the Cloud Permissions Firewall about the indicator of compromise. Okay, so just a really, really cool capability there. And the other thing is, after the hour transpires, this identity, the CPF zombie outbreak, will go automatically back where? Into the quarantine. So that identity can stay out there for the next time that it's needed with absolutely no risk to the business with it sitting out there. Now, I will say this for zombies. As a practitioner, do I think that you should just leave them all out there forever? Absolutely not, right? We've got to have hygiene. You've got to go clean up what I call the cyber litter and the cyber garbage is what we're protecting you from here, okay? But you don't have to go clean up 2,000 identities in 1 week, okay? And do it again and again and again and again as your number one priority, from an identity security standpoint. With the Cloud Permissions Firewall, the business is protected quickly, safely from all that risk, and then you can prioritize researching the individual ones if you want, and whether or not you want to delete them. You can also, use the Cloud Permissions Firewall to monitor whether or not they haven't been used in a year or two. And maybe that's the, line of delineation that you want to actually go out and delete them, which is fine, right? But up to that point in time, they were quarantined in case they were needed. So log back in real quick to the Cloud Permissions Firewall. And, again, it's really focused on illuminating that unused part of your cloud. For least privilege, it's the same thing. If we were to go through, and show you what we do here for protecting identities, it's just one click. We get all 36 identities to least privilege. You don't have to write any more policies. And if one of those identities attempts to use a permission, like creating a VPC or deleting an NAT gateway, the firewall is going to protect you, and it's going to do the same thing. It's going to send you a Slack or a Teams, and you're going to get that permissions on demand, message telling you whether or not you want to grant that entitlement back, right? And then I mentioned third parties. This is the last. When it comes to zombies, it's interesting because this is a fact. It's a part of the risk that's often buried in your CNAP or your CSPM or the native tools, right? As just another role, as just another trust relationship. But I think it's super important that folks have the ability not only to understand the unused identities that are out there, but which ones are unused that don't belong to you, right? And that's something that's really cool with a Cloud Permissions Firewall is that you're going to be able to see across all those accounts how many third parties have access. We've seen scenarios with 20 accounts where they've got 30 third parties to hundreds of accounts and hundreds of third parties that have access into your cloud, those roles, those identities, those trust relationships with those external IDs that haven't been used in years. And that's frightening, right? Because if one of those third parties gets popped, that identity is alive in your cloud. It has entitlements. It has permissions to go do things. And you need the ability to, A, be aware of it so you can make an educated decision, but B, be able to stop it. Right. And so you can see here in our demo system, we've got things that I created like Splunk and ServiceNow and Palo Alto. This could be something like Prisma Cloud, where, you can see that maybe this was a role for Prisma Cloud that one of my SEs created 2 years ago that granted access from this external ID into the production environment, right? But guess what? We never used it. Priorities changed, whatever. It was never even used, but it's still sitting out there with permissions to do what? Here you go. S3 read only, right? Unfortunately, a lot of the ones that we find from a third-party perspective are a lot scarier than that when it comes to, delete, create, modify permissions. It's basically full admin access. It's been sitting out there for months and often years, right? But with a cloud permissions firewall, all you have to do is say, same story, just block it, right? Do you want to block those third parties for now? And you can. And that essentially does the same thing. It says that those third parties can't use the entitlements that they've been granted. You're welcome to go research them, but at least from a risk standpoint, you centrally ensure that these third parties don't have access into your entire cloud or that part of your cloud with a click of a button without having to go write policies and do it by hand. And then even better, you can even put in a block all new, which is another capability with that default deny, where no one can have a third party role or identity or trust into your cloud without the cloud permissions firewall authorizing it. So really cool capabilities there with the cloud permissions firewall. And to kind of wrap things up, right? We do offer a 14-day free trial. You get the full product. It's incredibly enlightening from a landscape perspective to plug in and be able to take a look at the problem. That way you can make an educated decision. It really does only take 15 minutes to onboard, so simple, and then you can make an educated decision about whether or not this is something that you really want to implement. I will say this, the folks that we work with, it is really fun to work with them. And it's because we're alleviating a huge pain point of trying to do this by hand, like we talked about in the beginning of this presentation. They're trying to write SCPs, and it's manual, and it's breaking things, and they're having to adjust them constantly. Same thing with least privilege policies. And this gives them, for the first time ever, a huge breath of fresh air, because it allows them to get to least privilege fast by implementing the default deny and then granting the entitlements back that are needed using what we call permissions on demand, which is what I showed you there through Slack. So again, the alternative, it would take months, sometimes years, to try and achieve the same thing that you're able to achieve here with the cloud permissions firewall with a few clicks. So short and sweet. I hope that was super helpful to everyone. And I think really the takeaway is that there's a couple there, if you wanted to have an alternative to just deleting all these unused identities, there is an option, right? And that's to quarantine them. And I think that if you were to do it by hand, more power to you. It is possible, but it will be an uphill battle. But that is also why we created the cloud permissions firewall, was to make practitioners' lives easier that are trying to get to least privilege out there in the public cloud. So hopefully you learned some things, picked up a few nuggets. Matt, do we have any questions that have come in?
Yeah, we sure do. A lot of great information there, Jeff. And double tap. So we do offer that 14-day free trial. If you don't want to clean up zombies by hand manually, you can click the big purple button up top, and I've dropped a link in the chat to the right. So if you'd like to get started, feel free. And yeah, we had a couple questions come in. I will cast the first one up on the screen here and let you take it over, Jeff.
All right, I'm in presenter mode, so let me.
I'd be happy to read it to you too if you'd like.
Yeah, I don't think you want me doing it, because if I go back to the stage, it's going to look like the abyss of screen. So I'm just going to let you read it out to me.
Yeah, well, here we go. So going back to earlier in your presentation, somebody said, what led to you deciding on the 90-day time window for considering an identity a zombie?
That's a good question. So it's arbitrary, to be honest. So the 90-day time window, that is just something that we think is a good start. We also do a retrospective look back with the cloud permissions firewall. So when we plug in, we do a 90-day look back. And that kind of also is a deciding factor there for that initial 90-day value. But that allows us to plug in on day one and to tell you over the last 90 days prior what's been used and not used, and to start to make recommendations on, identities that you might want to quarantine that would be in a zombie status. Now, those settings are completely configurable in the Cloud Permissions Firewall. So you can extend that to 180 days, 360 days, if you want to quiet down the noise.
That's great. That's great. And here we go with another one. Somebody says, okay, if a zombie wakes up and say it needs hundreds, maybe thousands of different IAM roles and access needed, will the Cloud Permissions Firewall still accommodate that? Is there kind of an upper limit to how many IAM roles it can grant back to that identity?
So a zombie is typically going to be an individual identity or an individual role, which should be looked at as an individual identity. Okay, so a role is going to have entitlements granted to it. A user is going to have entitlements granted to it. And so if that zombie wakes up, you're essentially granting back one or more of the entitlements that it's already been granted. So a zombie's not going to wake up and attempt to use many different roles, and unless it tries to do role chaining or those kinds of things and assume different roles. But there's a couple of things. We're going to block the assume role initially, and when it becomes that second identity, we would then block that second one. So when it comes to identity chain exploitation, we would block it at every step of someone trying to do the lateral movement exploitation. But if it's something that is like a role that might be needed, for an entire day, you can grant it 24 hours, or you can make it perpetual and you can use all of its entitlements for an entire day, or perpetual. And if it's an entire day, it'll go back into the quarantine after 24 hours. If it's perpetual, in the Cloud Permissions Firewall, you just remove it from what we call the exemptions list, and it'll go right back into the quarantine.
Wonderful.
Good question.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. We've got one more. This seems to be more of a cost-related question for the Permissions Firewall. So it says, say I have a ton of accounts. What's the justification for the Cloud Permissions Firewall versus an FTE analyst?
So the justification. So let me give you a scenario. The Cloud Permissions Firewall, this is really fun to sell, right? There's no smoke and mirrors. This sucker, either you want to tackle the risk or you don't. And it's priced, I think, very, very competitively at list price is $1,500 an account per year. So imagine trying to, figure out, 2,000 identities across 200 accounts, and whether or not you could safely delete them and get them to least privilege. That would take a full-time employee. It could take them 6 months. It could take them 10 months, like it did that one customer. With the Cloud Permissions Firewall, we would eliminate those within one day. Okay. And with second day, you could quarantine every single one of them. So you have the benefit of, if you wanted to save that FTE, you could. But as a practitioner, I wouldn't recommend that. I would say that you could reassign the priorities of the FTE that otherwise would be having to do that. In other words, they could go focus on, maybe the CNAP tool, on workloads, on vulnerabilities, whatever it is, because you've been able to tell the business we've taken care of all of the risk with our unused identities in the cloud. And you can see it right here. And again, in 1 week, we took care of the risk with 2,000 identities. So there's a couple different ways, Matt, I think that I would spin the value story, but it is very, very affordable. And when you look at the opportunity cost of doing it the other way, it's pretty self-explanatory.
Right. And if say an individual person did spend the 6 to 10 months it took to remediate and fix all that, after they finish, there's going to be that much more work, if not more, to fix the new ones that have come in.
Well, yeah, because there's, again, without a default deny and something to automate it, this problem is never going to go away. It's just going to keep coming back over and over and over again. So you are kind of stuck in a never-ending cycle. We started using a phrase around here that you're never going to get to least privilege using the current tools that you have. It's going to be impossible unless you have a fundamental mind shift change in securing the hub instead of all the individual spokes, which causes all the spokes to fall in line.
Well put. Well, cool. That's all the questions that we've had come through. Jeff, thanks again for your time.
My
Hope
pleasure. Appreciate everyone
enjoyed this
joining.
session. Absolutely. We've got more webinars coming, so be on the lookout. We'll send you more invitations, and we'll see you next time. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.